All right, so we're recording. We're here, and okay, so my Hebrew is not good, but I'm going to attempt it. Maskilbina on non-Zionism. I might have gotten the enunciation wrong, but we're talking about this subject, and this word to me is just powerful in itself because I think there's a lot of problems with anti-Zionism. I think there's problems with Zionism itself, and the word just struck me as an attractive one. So before we get into anything else, what is non-Zionism? How would you explain that to somebody?
Right. So actually, the reason I chose that name for the Substack was exactly what you said, which is that uh, there are problems with Zionism, there are problems with anti-Zionism. I, at various stages in my life, have been a Zionist, including quite an extreme Zionist. I was raised, let's say, a moderate Zionist, but I became more extreme over time. Then there was a period when I was what's known as ultra-Orthodox or Haredi, in which I was anti-Zionist. I had an extreme anti-Zionist phase and then a more moderate anti-Zionist phase, and then I became a kind of extreme Zionist again. So I've done everything from every direction, and I know the insides out of both sides of the equation. I know the strengths of their positions, I know the weaknesses of their positions, and I guess I just exhausted myself ideologically, and I just stopped believing in any of it anymore. And but at the same time, I would venture to say that non-Zionism as a Jewish position, something that used to be, if you go back 100 years, was the default. Most people, if you ask them, are you a Zionist or not Zionist, they say, I haven't really thought about it. I think it's probably rarer now than it's ever been in history, as in um, geopolitical events, which I'm sure we'll discuss, very much bringing things to a head that people feel they very much have to take a side. I mean, one way out of it as a Jew is just to kind of say, I don't really identify as a Jew. I don't feel Jewish, whatever. And therefore, I don't have to pick a side. But anyone who does feel Jewish very much, I think, feels they have to pick a side for or against. And that includes also religious communities, like ultra Orthodox communities or somewhat ultra Orthodox communities, who were the last communities to maintain a kind of aloofness from Zionism. There are some ultra Orthodox communities famously that are very passionately against, that it's a big part of their identity. But the mainstream ultra Orthodox position for a long time was basically, this has nothing really to do with us, except on a logistical level. If we happen to be living in Israel, etc., we have relatives in Israel. But even they, in the last war, have become, as a rule, very gung ho, um, jingoist, basically. And if you ask them, they still might say, oh, "I'm not a Zionist," but in practice, they all have become very, very hardcore Zionists. And I thought that maybe this was the time to try and re-inject, see if there's any mileage in this thing, see if we can just take a kind of zoned out, chilled out approach to this issue. Probably not, if we're honest, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is there's this internal dynamic within Judaism, within Jews, that you have so many. So, first, you have it's like, do you even identify with Judaism consciously? Because there's a number of Jews in America where they have some kind of family affinity for Judaism, but they say, no, I'm not Jewish. And then you have the subsection of people who say, well, I am Jewish, but it's religious or it's not religious. And then you have subsection among the religious. Here's how religious I am. Here's what, I identify as Haredi, or I identify as Dati, or whatever that distinction is. And then again, even within the Haredi community, you have people who say, okay, well, we are Zionists, or no, we're anti-Zionists. And there's so many different degrees of division. And that outside of that, there is an interaction with the non-Jewish community, the wider world. And this question of, how much is Israel influenced by these external considerations? That division between Israelis and Jewish Americans. How are those two groups influencing each other? And then, I think of a guy like George Soros, who I think for Netanyahu is an opponent. And people are not really aware of that, but there is even Josh Shapiro, so you considered for the vice president. he is, I think, a while ago, I mean, maybe the story's changing, but a while ago, he volunteered for the IDF. And then other people are saying, well, he's against Netanyahu. So there's so many confusion of what it means to be pro-Israel, anti-Israel. Is that the same thing as being pro-Netanyahu, anti-Netanyahu? And there's this question, I think, that you're pointing to, which is this a popularity contest? Is this, a democratic question of the future of Zionism, anti-Zionism? Or is this something that is defined actually by a very small number of people, very concentrated numbers of people? So whether it's Netanyahu as an individual personality, I'll say that a lot of people criticize Netanyahu. You might be a critic of Netanyahu. The way that I view him is there's a coalition, a Likud coalition, that is almost impossible to put together on like rational terms. It's pulled in so many different directions. And yet somehow through his force of personality, whether it's corruption, nepotism, people can speculate, but he's been able to keep that together. And so when people say, well, if we just get rid of Netanyahu, then everything will be better because it'll be less corrupt. I'm like, actually, the corruption is what is maybe papering over some of the social and religious division. So there's a trade-off there. You don't just get rid of corruption and then everyone is kumbaya, but actually there's a trade-off. So maybe from that you can go in any direction, but to give you a specific question is, in the interests of non-Zionism, maybe moving toward that position and assuming that, and you can contradict me, but assuming Netanyahu is sort of the extreme pro-Zionist end, is there even a hope within a democratic framework or a coalition government parliamentary system that you could even kind of turn back the clock to the 1990s or earlier and get someone who's more moderate than Netanyahu? Is that possible, or is this institutionally and demographically, I don't want to say a hopeless case, but I'm just saying within the framework of the current Israeli constitution, is there a process by which non-Zionism can achieve its goals or move in that direction?
Okay, so let's deal with the BB question first. So I actually the last article I actually published an article 5 minutes ago about a completely different issue, but the one I published last week on Friday was called "The Case for BB," and it's it's somewhat ironic because in many respects BB's been a very bad prime minister and is currently being a very bad prime minister. But there is, like you say, a certain truth in which the stability of the system that exists right now in Israel is, to a very large extent, based upon him as a human being. That he's knitted it together by means he's a very, very competent and adept politician. And he has that will to power that I think all great politicians need, for better or worse. And he's made himself extremely central to knitting together different groups in a coalition, which have formed a stable government for something ridiculous like 19 of the last 21 years, something like that. And without him, that system, I think, does fall apart. And partly that's because he generated that system himself. So by nature, you take him away, the system falls apart. But that's also because he's worked very consciously to make himself central to that system. So the Likud started off as a Cherut, which was the political wing or the kind of post wing of the Irgun, which was the main terrorist organization in pre-state mandate Palestine, the main Jewish terrorist organization, let's put it that way. And they were, for sure, a small minority of the pre-state population and also of the immediate post-state population. And Cherut became Likud. Likud literally means union, basically. And Cherut became Likud by accumulating groups onto it. So one of the main groups that came over were called the General Zionists, who basically believed in a free market economy. That was their thing, Zionism plus a free market economy. And by joining them to Cherut, in addition to some other parties to form the Likud, free market economics became the Likud ideology, even though the original Cherut weren't into that kind of thing at all. Although, if you go one stage back, Jabotinsky himself was. Anyway, I'm rambling a little, but the point is that Bibi took a party, Likud, that already had a lot of moving parts within it, and he added other moving parts. He built on, but he really strengthened this permanent relationship between the Haredim and the Likud, which definitely didn't exist before him, and in fact was clearly openly opposed by the Haredi rabbinical leadership. The idea that Haredim should be an adjunct of a Zionist function is supposed to be totally anathema to Haredi belief system. So he forged that. He also built on another thing which is well known, which is the Likud voter base in the Mizrahi or Sephardi or Mina Jews of Middle Eastern origin, which exists both within the Likud, but there's also this kind of outside of the Likud element, which is Shas, which is the religious Sephardi party. And he again forged this permanent alliance between Shas and the Likud. Shas voted in favor of the Oslo peace process. They did so with a lot of controversy, and they said that they regretted and etc. But the fact is, they did. It happened. It's something that could never happen today. So Bibi has built up this block, but at the same time, what he's done is he's systematically cleared the Likud of anyone who's competent or could be a threat to him in any way. And a lot of Israeli political parties, the smaller ones, are people who used to be in the Likud or used to be at least allied with the Likud. And when they started presenting a threat to him in any way, he maneuvered them out. So that's how Naftali Bennett started. That's how Ayelet Shaked started. I'm not particularly buff. I forget their names. The guy who's the head of the New Hope Party, they call it in English, Saar, etc.
Benny Gantz is also one.
Benny Gantz is, what is his origin? No, Benny Gantz is slightly different from one. And Benny Gantz is a general. So he comes from outer politics. And what centrist parties like to do is they like to just pick a general and then make them their leader. So he's the kind of person that he could have, I don't think he actually ever got to the stage of joining the Likud. But I think he probably could have joined the Likud if it hadn't been for Bibi not wanting people like that to join the Likud. He certainly isn't a principled, he certainly wouldn't be out of place ideologically. He'd be on the left flank of the Likud, but he wouldn't be way out on the left flank by any means. So Bibi's got rid of anyone competent, and it really is the case that the Likud party at the moment is from top to bottom now a really, really dumb party. Everyone except Bibi in the Likud is just inarticulate, incapable of expressing a rational thought in public, embarrassing levels of incompetence. And he actually prefers to work really with the Haredi parties because they're more loyal to him personally. He's worked very hard at making the Likud just a kind of a Bibi party, but the Haredi parties are kind of a hyper Bibi party. They're the hyper Likud in that they have no opinions out. They have certain demands, mostly financial. He meets their demands, and in return, they block vote with him. That's the general idea. So you take out Bibi from the equation. This specific political configuration that has become for 2 decades how Israel is governed, basically, and nothing else has worked as a stable form of government. You take him away, I don't see that this thing can continue. But as you say, I mean, Israel needs some kind of stable system of government, and the problems Bibi is trying to solve in his manner are not going to go away. So that's Bibi. As regards non-Zionism, I mean, look, in truth, I think non-Zionism, should we say, is in the position that Zionism was in 1880. As in, it's not going to achieve anything today. Zionism is very, very much the ideology of the state of Israel. It commands the adherence of, at the very least, 80% of the Jewish population are genuinely Zionists. They would identify as Zionists, but it's not just I would identify. They do believe in it. That's a conservative estimate because I think a lot of the people that you might not count as Zionists, like I say, a lot of Haredim really have de facto become Zionists. So even if they would deny it, they've absorbed a lot of basic Zionist concepts. The problem is that if you believe in Zionism and you have this intractable Arab-Israeli conflict that's now been going on for over 70 years, well, it depends how you want to define it, maybe 100 years, whatever you want to put it. The instinct is to fix it. You want to fix it. So there's two ways of fixing it. You can fix it through a peace process, or you can fix it through a war process. Fixing it through a peace process doesn't seem to work. Fixing it for a war process, we haven't really tried, but there's no reason to think it would work. You can say that we've tried this time. We've given it a kind of a beta run, so to speak. You know, we've obviously caused a lot of devastation in Gaza and killed a lot of people, and it doesn't seem to have solved anything. So it would seem that the numbers of people we need to kill to solve it would be in the hundreds of thousands at least. And it doesn't seem that we'll be allowed to do that, even leaving aside moral qualms you may or may not have. So that creates a big psychic tension, I think, in any Zionist. You've got this, you have this narrative of the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, becoming captains of our own fate, no longer being ruled by the nations, no longer being subject to their whims. But on the other hand, you have just a big mess. You have a big mess that you can't fix. And you put yourself in this mess. No one forced you. If anything, the opposite. People begged you not to. People told you not to. You insisted on doing this, and now you're stuck in this big mess. And I think the temptation to fix it one way or another is irresistible, except for Bibi. Bibi has a certain psychological profile that has allowed him to use people on the right or people on the left as necessary for his coalition, but in fact, preserve as much as possible the status quo. So settlement expansion, for example, has been slower under Bibi than under any other prime minister. Now, that partly depends on how you define it. If you define that in terms of number of houses built, it's not true. But if you define it in terms of number of new settlements established, it's not only true, it's true by a ridiculously big margin. That basically no new settlements have been established during Bibi's tenure. Under the last government, because he brought in these extreme right-wing parties into the coalition, and this was their demand, they weren't really established, they were legalized because they were illegal outposts, but 4 new illegal outposts were legalized. And that may, to some extent, have played a role in building up to tensions that eventually led to October the 7th. But basically, Bibi has tried not to expand settlements. On the other hand, he steadfastly refused to give away any settlements, to make any kind of concessions, to make any kind of even tokenistic gestures, really, that would tempt or are supposed to tempt someone to the peace table. He really has tried. He is the pioneer of the concept of conflict management. And the fact is, in many respects, he's done a good job. Israel's economy has grown very precipitously under him. Now, from the perspective of a citizen, there's pluses and minuses. House prices have shot through the roof. It used to be very affordable to rent a flat in Israel. Now it's extremely unaffordable. But from the perspective of statecraft, obviously economic growth is good. The amount of resources that are available to the state to use in its military, etc., has grown very, very fast, much faster under his tenure than any other Israeli prime minister. And he's also been successful, I think, beyond what anyone could have thought in terms of building, alliances might be a bit of a strong word, but, peaceful relations with various Arab states, the Abraham Accords, a certain degree with Syria. Much more, and it's not just that he did it, it's that he did it without any concessions on the Israel-Palestine issue at all. As in the assumption, and it's a perfectly reasonable assumption, is that if you want to make peace with the Arabs, you want to move forward relations with the Arabs, you have the thing you have to give them in return is something, maybe not a Palestinian state, but some progress, some sign of a Palestinian state. He's given them nothing whatsoever on that issue, and yet he's made more progress in terms of normalizing relations with Arab states than any other prime minister. So he has real concrete achievements, but there is this aspect that it's kind of doing this is a very complicated act of juggling. And obviously, on October the 7th, the juggling fell apart. And there are long-term, and that represents obviously a total and stunning failure of Bibi's whole approach to conflict management. And he's had to do what he always didn't want to do, which was a full-scale land invasion of Gaza. Consistently throughout his tenure, he is the one who has been vetoing an invasion of Gaza. he was opposed to withdrawing from Gaza, but once you withdraw from Gaza, he's also opposed to entering Gaza. So he's always favored targeted assassinations where possible. Where not possible, airstrikes. Where airstrikes aren't going to cut it, some limited kind of incursion. And he's been under enormous pressure, not just from the ideological right wing to do more in Gaza, to do something big, but also just from people who live in the Gaza area and have been subject to rocket attacks. And only he's had the strength to say to people who've been living with, it depends on the place, but, let's say monthly rocket attacks for a decade and a half, okay, which is obviously something that no one in Italy would expect to put up with such a thing, or Romania or something, or whatever. He's been the one who has the courage to say, not explicitly, but implicitly, which is, I empathize with your situation, but we have a state to run. So he has this reputation in the West, or at least in certain circles of the West, as a warmonger. In fact, he's the opposite. If it wasn't for him, this Gaza war would have happened ages ago. Now, maybe that would have been a good thing. Since it's happened, maybe it would have been better had it happened on our terms at a time of our choosing. We went into Gaza in complete chaos without any kind of real strategy or anything. As in, I remember very well, it was, so the whole thing happened on the Sabbath, on Shabbat. And the next Shabbat, I remember I thought, but it wasn't just me, everyone thought, we're going to turn on our phones after Shabbat, Saturday night, and, we're going to see scenes of carnage in Gaza, because we're going in full force, everyone's in, it's going to be kaboom. And then actually you turn on Shabbat, nothing happened. And then nothing happened also the next week. It was a whole 3 weeks before they went in, because they didn't know what to do. So given that we've been into Gaza, given we've killed all these people, given that we destroyed all these buildings, we've emitted all this CO2 in the atmosphere, that we've trashed our international reputation, etc., maybe we should have just done it 10 years ago and had it done, and done it, in a more ordered and systematic way. But I still kind of think that really, if you go back and if you were to go back 10 years and run the numbers, Bibi's strategy was still probably the best strategy based upon expected probabilities. As in, if we could have got through this without October the 7th and continued another 10 years, then we've had another 10 years of economic growth, another 10 years of managing this conflict, another 10 years of improved relations with Arab states. And I don't think October 7th was an inevitable consequence of Bibi's conflict of Bibi's strategy of conflict management. I think it was bad handling, and that bad handling, to a large extent, has to do with him. It's the fact that he formed this government that's full of incompetents and maniacs and just low IQ people, and there was this whole judicial reform thing which threw the country into chaos. And it's clear that all sorts of people in the army and the government weren't talking to each other, and the reports have not really been published yet, but what has been published shows that there was just massive kind of organizational disarray at the highest levels of the government, the military, the whole security apparatus. And he has to take the blame for that. But I, for one, and I am almost for one in this, kind of still think that he was probably right to at least give it a shot. But he screwed up. So what are you going to do? All right. Next question, maybe.
Okay.
I've been rambling.
Next question is that a lot of critics of Netanyahu in America and anti-Zionists in general would dispute that last part, which is Netanyahu basically did the best thing possible to avoid October 7th. It happened. Now we're here. Their narrative would be that the Abraham Accords, specifically in doing exactly what you said, and not giving any concessions to Palestine, while saying, look, we're going to establish relationships with Jordan and Saudi and Egypt and whatever. By doing that, they put Hamas in a situation where they said, okay, Netanyahu, he's doing it. He's actually creating peace between Israel and all these Arab states. We no longer have a role in the world. We no longer have friends. Or this is the direction it's going. And so because they were put in a situation where Netanyahu was getting everything, the Arab states were getting what they wanted, the Palestinians realized, okay, we're no longer a bargaining chip in this game. We're no longer part of the conversation. And when they realized that the window was closing on them, that's when they decided, okay, we're going to basically engage in what amounted to a suicidal attack, effectively, because of what's going on now, and because that's the only way that we're going to get these Arab states to halt this peace process. It was sort of a last-ditch effort. Now you could argue, well, that's also hopeless, because someday the war will end, not the world, but the war will end, and the peace process will continue, and they'll have won nothing at all. I mean, all they'll have done is brought infamy on their names. But at least that's the logic. It's better to halt the peace process through the war than to allow that to continue, and then the door to statehood is closed forever, because if you don't have Arab allies, who do you have? You have nobody. So that would be the argument. Do you think any part of that is true, or you have a counter argument?
So look, I think, Curtis Yarvin, one of the things he says is that politics is current history. At least politics should be current history. But one of the differences between studying current history and past history is that past history, you have all these declassified documents that you can look at and you can investigate this stuff. And current history, a lot of the time you're guessing. So when we talk about Hamas's strategy, we are to a large extent guessing. But my opinion is that I don't think Hamas changed their strategy I don't think they changed the strategy full stop. I think they've been through successive multiple phases of kind of derangement and radicalization on what was already an extremely radical base. And partly that's because of the incentive structure that Israel was kind of providing on their end, and partly because that's how institutions like this tend to work. But Israel works on a deterrence. Israel's whole the watchword of Israel's defense strategy from 48, but really from before 48, is deterrence. And if you keep deterring people, who do you eventually end up with? You end up with people who are undeterrable. And who are undeterrable? Maniacs, basically. And I mean, Yahya Sinwar, I think, genuinely is a very, very mentally ill human being. If you look at him, he has a very clear, I can say this to you because most people I say this don't even know what I mean, but he has a very clear criminal phenotype. You look at where his eyes are placed in his head, you look at what his forehead looks like. He's a born psychotic. He had this brain tumor while he was in a Israeli hospital, and they saved his life, which was stupid. But I think it's quite reasonable to suppose that the effects of his brain tumor operation left him a bit more screwy even than he was. I think there's quite credible reports. He genuinely, I'm not an expert in Islamic messianic theology, but there's some Maui or whatever Majda thingamajig, some angel, something. He talks to someone. He thinks he's talking to someone who's involved in the end times or whatever. He's genuinely a very, very crazy person, and I don't think I think, some people don't take this seriously. It just can't be the case that there's a leader of a de facto country who he bases his policy on the belief that if he does enough killing, that angels are going to come from the sky on horseback and start killing people with swords. But he does. That's what I think he does. So I think Hamas have been planning, and one thing we do have kind of leaked is these kind of plans that Hamas had for administering Israel after conquering it on October the 7th. They had plans. This person is going to be in command of northern Israel. Okay, this person is going to be in command of arresting everyone in Tel Aviv and putting them in displacement camps and stuff. Really stuff that's so beyond tethered from reality, right? So my personal view on why October the 7th happened is that they've been planning it a long, long time. Have you ever heard of the Jamie Bolger? It's a bit of a weird analogy, but I'll get to it.
You're gonna
have you heard of Jamie
explain
Bolger?
It. I haven't heard.
So Jamie Bolger was a kid who was killed in a very gruesome fashion in the early 1990s in England, in Liverpool. He was abducted by a pair of young teenagers, and they tortured him to death in